Welcome back, everyone, to the second session of the conference in the afternoon. May I invite Professor Catherine Hardy again to welcome and introduce the first speaker of this session. Professor Hardy, please.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Irina Urbaneva, Venerable Tenzin Choidron. She is a Chief Research Fellow at the Institute for Mongolian, Buddhist, and Tibetan Studies of the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences. She graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy at Lomonosov Moscow State University in 1979 and worked as a teacher of philosophy at the Altai State Institute of Culture from 1979 to 1981. From 1981 to 1984, she studied at a postgraduate program at the Lomonosov Moscow State University, and in 1985, she defended her PhD in the philosophy of the specificity of ethical knowledge. From 1986 to the present, she has worked at the IMBT. In 1994, she defended her doctoral dissertation on The Man at Baikal and the World of Inner Asia, a philosophical perspective on history at the Mongolian National University, and she holds a Mongolian and Russian doctoral degree in philosophy. She has been studying Buddhism since 1993, and in 2002, she took her monastic vows, and from 2003 to 2004, she took an intensive course in Tibetan language at the College of Higher Tibetan Studies in Dharamsala. Professor Urbaneva is a renowned Russian Buddhist scholar and translator of Tibetan texts and the author of more than 150 scientific articles and 20 books. So please join me in welcoming her.
I'm very glad to see everyone here and wish you all peace, good health, and success in your study and practice of Buddhism. Thank to the organizers, especially to Venerable Kok Yuen and to Professor Halikas. The first slide shows the structure of my presentation. In modern Russia, two models of Buddhism, Buddhist revival, are implemented. The first model is represented by the Buddhist traditional Sangha of Russia, headed by Pandita Humble Lama Dambayushev. Dambayushev urges that Buryat Buddhism has always been autonomous and spiritually sufficient. He uses the phenomenon of the incorrupt body of Humble Lama Itigelov as proof of the independence of Buryat Buddhism. In his words, Buryat Buddhism has been completely self-sufficient for centuries. The Buryats received Buddhism from Damba Dorje Zayaev, who received it in his first birth from Buddha Kashyapa and in his second birth from Buddha Shakyamuni. Another Another model is being implemented in Kalmykia and Tuva, and it aims to revive Buddhism as a monastic institution based on the authentic transmission of Indo-Tibetan Mahayana. With a brief historical overview, I'd like to attempt to demonstrate that the current ideology of national Buryat Buddhism promoted by Dambayushev is based on the erroneous idea of an autocephalous Buddhist church in Russia, which was formed during the imperial period, and on the incorrect concept of traditional Buddhism, and ignoring the fundamental importance of the authentic transmission of that dharma. On this slide, you see the goal and objectives of my presentation, which contains the answer to these questions. The history of Buddhism in Russia, according to Russian literature on Buddhism, usually begins in the 17th century. And the Gelug school is considered to be the traditional form of Buddhism in Russia. However, this is not entirely correct point of view. Firstly, highly developed Buddhist cultures existed in the Far East, including territories that are now part of Russia, in the state of Bohai, Georgian Tenzin, and Eastern Xia. Thus, Buddhism began to spread there at the same time as in China and Tibet, and it can probably be classified as a Far Eastern branch of Mahayana. Consequently, Far Eastern Mahayana can be considered a traditional religion for Russia. Secondly, before becoming a part of the Russian Empire, the northern Mongols and the western Mongols, ancestor of the Buryat and Kalmyks, were unified within the single Mongol world called Great Mongolia. The spread of Buddhism among them is integral to the history of Mongolian Buddhism. Among them, Buddhism of different traditions, Sakya, Kagyu, and Gelug, was historically widespread. The northern and western Mongols became acquainted with Buddhism much earlier than the 17th century. The Mongol Oirat Charter of 1640 declared Gelug Buddhism the official religion for all Mongols. When the Kalmyks became subjects of Russia and founded the Kalmyk Khanate, they brought with them a monastic tradition and rich Buddhist literary heritage. Not only the Kalmyks, but also the Hori-Buryats, who returned from Eastern Mongolia to Transbaikalia in the early 17th century, were already Buddhists when they became subjects of the Russian states. Thus, the history of the spread of Buddhism among the Buryats and Kalmyks did not begin when they became part of Russia, but continued as a stage of mass dissemination. Russian authors of works on the history of Buddhism in Russia attribute the decisive role in the development of Buddhism in Russia to the favorable policies of the Tsarist government. And state support. But in reality, imperial policy was aimed at restricting Buddhism and Christianizing and Russifying the Buryats and Kalmyks. Paradoxically, the Tsarist policy had the opposite effect. Buddhism became the main ethnically consolidating factor for the Buryats and Kalmyks. And in the second half of the 19th, early 20th centuries, monastic Buddhism experienced its heyday. Along with the erroneous dating of the beginning of Buddhism spread among the Buryats and Kalmyks, Russian historians have also developed another erroneous idea, that of official recognition of Buddhism within the Russian Empire, and have highlighted two dates. 1741 as the date of the official recognition of the Buddhist religion by Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, and 1764 as the date of the establishment of the position of Pandita Khambo Lama. But the decree of 1741 was issued by local authorities, not the Empress. And as writes Nikolai Tsarempilov, it does not represent an official recognition of Buddhism in the Russian Empire. As for the title Pandita Khambo Lama, the first Pandita Khambo Lama, Dambadarja Zayaev, received this title and the right to preach the Buddha's teaching among the northern people from the 7th Dalai Lama and the 5th Panchen Lama. Catherine Great merely recognized Pandita Khambo Lama Zayaev as the head of the Buryat Buddhist. Hence, the official recognition of Buddhism in Russia was a contradictory and lengthy process of survival and self-preservation of the Buddhist religion in the conditions of the absolute dominance of Orthodox Christianity and the Russification policy of the Tsarist government. Until the fall of the empire, Buddhism was considered as a foreign religion in Russia. The Lamaist Church was an instrument in the Russian Empire to control and limit Buddhism and cut off the ties of the Lamaites of Russia with Tibet and Mongolia. It became a cornerstone of the tradition of subordination and cooperation between the Buddhist clergy and Russian secular authorities. The imperial creation of an autocephalous Buddhist church, contingent on sovereign ties with Tibetan and Mongolian centers, fundamentally contradicted authentic spiritual transmission. Despite the restrictive imperial policy, the Buryats and Kalmyks before the 1917 revolution sought to provide their Sangha with sets of canonical texts in Tibetan and Old Mongolian, as well as oral transmission of these texts, initiations, and instructions received in Tibet from the Dalai Lamas, Panchen Lamas, and in Mongolia from the Bogda Gagan. The monastic education system was based on the curricula of Tibetan philosophical and tantric monasteries and Tibetan textbooks. Pilgrims from Transbaikalia and Kalmykia visited Tibet. Buryats and Kalmyk went to Tibet to study Buddhism. An unique aspect of the transmission of Buddha's teachings in Russia is intercultural dialogue and exchange. The influence of Buddhist philosophy can be noticed in the works of Russian writers, as well as in the thought of philosophers like Solovyov, Berdyaev, Losky, Bulgakov, Frank. Scientists and thinkers such as Vernadsky, Tsiolkovsky, and Helena Blavatsky also drew inspiration from Buddhist concepts, as did cultural figures like Nikolai Rerich. Russian Orientalists such as Schelling, Kovalevsky, Igumnov, Popov, Vladimir Tsov not only studied canonical Buddhist texts, but also worked closely with Buryat Lamas and observed living Buddhist practices. The role of the Russian School of Buddhist Studies, headed by Cherbatsky, was also great. But the autocephalous Lamaist Church, established in the Russian Empire, was a controversial phenomenon. On the one hand, clergy led by Pandita Khambo Lamas in Buryatia and Shadjan Lamas in Kalmykia used every opportunity to ensure the transmission of Dharma. On the other hand, embeddedness of Buddhist institution within the state contributed to secularization and led to internal crisis and schism in the Sangha in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This led to attempts at reform and the emergence of non-monastic forms of Buddhism. In the history of non-monastic Buddhism, which was actively manifested during the Soviet period, there were two individuals who played a prominent role. The first was Lobsang Sandan Tsidenov. He spent 23 years in the forest and was very popular among the Buryats. In April 1919, he became the head of the theocratic Kodun state, which was established in the territory of the present-day Kizhingensky district of Buryatia in 1919 and existed until 1922. In this temporary Buddhist state, the moral norms of not participating in the affairs of unfair authorities were established. This gave the Buryat people the mental strength to resist morally in the years to come. The second outstanding leader of non-monastic Buddhism was Vidya Dandaron. He was the reincarnation of the High Tibetan Lama Gyaltsen Gyaltsen and the successor to Lobsang Sandan. Dandaron was repressed in 1937 and spent a total of about 20 years in Soviet prisons and camps. There he studied Buddhism from repressed Buryat lamas and Western philosophy from Russian intellectuals. In the camps, he developed the principles of his teaching, Neo-Buddhism, in which he synthesized Buddhism with European philosophy and modern science. His students were intellectuals from Moscow, Leningrad, Vilnius, and other Soviet cities. They made significant contributions to the study of Buddhism. His life and death became an example of great spiritual strength that could not be defeated by the totalitarian regime. There were also many other unknown and secret yogis who lived among the people and supported their faith in the Three Jewels. Thanks to this faith, which has always been preserved among the Buryat, Kalmyk, and Tuvan people, an active revival of Buddhism has become possible in the post-Soviet era. Tsanit Lama Agvan Dorjiev played a huge role in the history of Buddhism in Russia. This Buryat Lama was an advisor and mentor for the 13th Dalai Lama. He also served as a diplomat mediating political relations between Russia and Tibet. However, what is important to us now is that thanks to his prophetic vision, he foresaw the tragic fate of Buddhism in Russia and its subsequent rebirth and planted the seeds for the revival of the true Dharma when he sent groups of talented young Buryats and Kalmyks to study in Tibet during the 1920s. These envoys, educated in Lhasa, later became instrumental in the history of Tibetan monasteries. Their Tibetan reincarnations and students are now vital in reviving Buddhism in Russia and spreading Dharma in the West, embodying Dorjiev's far-reaching vision. Finally, let us turn to structural block D, challenges facing the revival of Buddhism in Russia. Firstly, the legacy of the imperial and Soviet periods poses obstacle to the revival of Buddhism in Russia. As in the Russian Empire, religious institutions in the new Russia are part of the state system and involved in state policy. The Buddhist clergy is preoccupied with the 8 worldly dharmas, and as in the Soviet period, there is no genuine monastic sangha. Instead of educational work with the population, the clergy provides religious services according to a price list. The traditional Buddhist Sangha of Russia, led by Pandita Khamba Lama Ayushev, has inherited some characteristic features of the Lamist church. The principle of autocephaly of the Buddhist Church of Russia, the authoritarian rule of Pandita Khamba Lama, the tradition of absolute subordination of the Sangha to the highest state authority, the use of Buddhism in state policy, and distancing from the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism and the trend of secularization of the clergy. Although the Buddhist Association of Kalmyk and Tuva are also integrated into the state system, unlike the religious policy of the Buddhist traditional Sangha of Russia, which aims to form a distinctive national version of Buddhism, They focus primarily on restoring the authentic transmission of the Dharma and reviving the monastic Sangha. The development of Dharma centers of various traditions and schools is becoming a serious alternative to institutional Buddhism. As for the Tibetan tradition, 2 Tibetan lamas who have taken Russian citizenship have made an enormous contribution to the development of non-monastic Buddhism in Russia. They are Geshe Jampa Lay and Yeshe Lode Rinpoche. In recent years, online courses in Buddhist philosophy, online teachings, and online retreats conducted by many foreign preachers of various Buddhist traditions have become widespread in Russia. It is becoming difficult for people to distinguish authentic Buddhism from distorted forms of it. I am inclined to think that online initiations and teachings may accelerate the decline of Buddhism rather than contribute to its preservation and development. Conclusion. Buddhist institutions reviving in modern Russia have inherited valuable traditions from the past, educational programs, Buddhist architecture, art, and traditional medicine. At the same time, however, certain stereotypes from the past remain, hindering the revival of authentic Buddhism. These stereotypes include the idea of a distinct Buddhist Buddhism, distancing oneself from the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism, and the functioning of religious institutions as a part of the bureaucratic state system. At the same time, alternative forms of Buddhism are emerging. They involve not only traditional Buddhists from Buryatia, Kalmykia, and Tuva, but also representatives of other ethnic groups. Traditional and new Buddhists face common challenges. Developing 21st century Buddhism based on authentic transmission, creating a Russian language Buddhist canon, and promotion of the formation of a new worldview paradigm in Russia based on mutual understanding and cooperation between representatives of different ethnic, cultural, and religious groups for the sake of the common future of humanity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Urbaneva, for that richly informative presentation. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much.
My English is not fluent, then my young colleague Zina will help me with translation.
Yes, Georges.
Thank you very much, Venerable, for this wonderful talk. Could you elaborate a little bit on the new forms of Buddhism that are emerging, and where do they come from? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Новые формы буддизма.
Да, немножко пояснить, расширить о новых формах буддизма, откуда они идут и как они развиваются.
В Новой России зарегистрировано множество организаций, представляющих буддийские направления, разные буддийские направления и школы. В принципе, все существующие в мире буддийские направления, школы, в настоящее время представлены в России.
So, in modern Russia, there are many different religious organizations that represent different schools and directions of Buddhism. Almost every single school of Buddhism that exists in some way is represented in Russia.
Эти направления являются новыми для России, потому что в имперский период официальный институт буддийской религии был представлен только школой Gelug.
These schools are new for Russia because during the Empire period, the Buddhist teaching was represented only by the church, the Lama's church.
К новым формам буддизма, то есть нетрадиционным для имперской России, можно отнести немонастырские формы буддизма, которые я уже упоминала. Это так называемые степные ламы, это отшельники, йогины. Их традиция она сохранялась и в советский период, и благодаря этим немонастырским формам буддизма после падения Советского Союза буддистам удается достаточно успешно возрождать буддизм в стране.
So these non-traditional schools of Buddhism can be represented by non-monastic practitioners that have been mentioned in the presentation. These are so-called steppe lamas and yogin hermits that were active also during the Soviet period. And due to their effort after the end of the Soviet Union, people nowadays have an opportunity to revive and evolve these traditions.
Наряду с буддийскими институтами широкое распространение в стране получили дхарма-центры разных направлений.
And along with the Buddhist organizations, the Dharma centers are also quite widely represented in modern Russia as well.
Are they all Tibetan Buddhist traditions, or from different schools?
Тибетский буддизм остается, пожалуй, основным направлением буддизма в России. И не только школа Гелук. Есть также дхарма-центры, представляющие нигмапинский буддизм, буддизм Кагью, Сакья.
So Tibetan Buddhism remains the most prominent form of Buddhism that exists in Russia, but there are also Dharma centers of such schools as Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya.
I might take advantage of having the microphone and ask a question, if that's okay. So I was curious about how the Russian government regulates foreign teachers who may wish to come to Russia or might be invited to come to Russia to give teachings, whether there is an openness and what the procedures and policy is in this regard.
Спрашивает, как современное правительство России регулирует деятельность иностранных учителей, которые могут приезжать, хотеть приезжать, как это регулируется, что...
В настоящее время Россию наводнили иностранные учителя-гастролеры, множество учителей самых разных направлений, как буддизма, так и религии Бон, и российское правительство пока не придумала никаких мер сопротивления.
Okay, so nowadays, as Professor states, Russia is being flooded by different teachers that come from many different schools, also from Bon tradition as well. And as of now, Russian government does not have any restricting policies towards it. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Venerable, for this fascinating talk. Just reflecting on connections to the sort of mainstream of Tibetan Buddhism, and you've sort of highlighted this problem that there's a sort of disconnect from Tibetan Buddhism in general. Do you see young monks or nuns from Buryatia and these places going down to India, for example, studying in the big monasteries like Drepung, Sera, Ganden? Do people go down to India like that, or is all of the training for monastics in Russia?
Есть ли ученики, которые ездят, например, в Индию, как бы с целью приблизиться вот к индотибетской традиции, и ездит ли, в общем, кто-то в Дрепунгама, например, в Индию?
Yes, of course. Конечно, очень многие, не только бурятские, тувинские, калмыцкие студенты обучаются в тибетских монастырях в Индии. Также есть и русские буддийские монахи. Сегодня говорят даже о русском буддизме.
Yeah, there are many different Buddha, Kalmyk, and Tuvan people who go to India to study, and also there are a lot of Russian, ethnically Russian people that go to India to study. And nowadays there is the discourse of Russian Buddhism is being developed at the moment.
We have time for one more question. Yes, better.
Now, my question is about sort of the need for an independent Buryat Buddhism, and so I'm not sure if you mentioned who is actually expressing that, and what would be the reason for, and also in terms of the idea of Buddhist transmission, what would be the reason for wanting to distance oneself, for example, from the Dalai Lama, and for example from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and how is that reconciled with Buddhist ideas of transmission?
Это официальная концепция лидера буддийской традиционной санхи России Дамбе Юшеева. Он считает, что бурятский буддизм всегда исторически был независим от тибетского, и в качестве доказательства он приводит пример нетленного тела Хамбо-ламы Витягелова и утверждает, что первый пандита Хамбо-лама Дамбада Жазаяев получил прямую трансмиссию учения Будды от Будд Кашьяпы и Шакьямуни.
С какой целью? Зачем такое?
Дело в том, что это обосновать автокефальность бурятского вообще буддизма в России.
So this idea of independent Buryat Buddhism is being, pushed forward by the current head of Buddhist traditional Sangha of Russia, Damba Yushev. And as it has been mentioned in the presentation, he puts a lot of effort to prove this point. And he states that the first Hambo Lama of Russia, Zayaev, he received the teaching directly from Buddha's from Buddha Shakyamuni and Kashyapa. And the reasons for such the reasons for this may lie in the wish to to create autocephalous state of Buddhist Buddhism and to autocephaly, to the build foundation of autocephaly.
Он считает, что в суверенном государстве буддизм тоже должен быть независимым ни от кого.
He thinks that in sovereign country, the religion and Buddhism in particular also has to be sovereign, not dependent on any other foreign traditions.
Which sounds actually like a Russian idea.
It is, yes. Yes, and Professor. Vajrayana Buddhism.
Yes, да, ваджраяна буддизма также присутствует в России, особенно русские буддисты увлекаются тантрическими практиками.
Yeah, Vajrayana is widely represented in Russia, and there are a lot of Russian practitioners that are extremely fond of tantric practices. Как этот независимый бурятский буддизм?
Ну, Дамба Юшеев считает, что в Бурятии, в Бурятском буддийском университете Дашичуэн Харвин возрождена традиция обучения и буддийской философии, и тантре, поэтому...
То есть она вообще, абсолютно отдельная.
Да.
So it's something completely separate and different, not differing it was sort of, and the professor strongly opposes this, she does not support these ideas at all.
Thank you very much again to Professor Urbaneva.